Blood shouldn't look like spilled motor oil, but under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the warehouse, that was exactly what it resembled. Victor Hale didn't ask for much in his line of work. Loyalty, silence, a clean ledger. But when his men dragged Sadie in, dumping her onto the concrete like discarded luggage, something in his meticulously ordered world fractured. He had given a simple order: bring her to me. He hadn't told them to break her. Now someone was going to bleed. Cigar smoke hung in the stale air of the office, thick and acrid. Victor sat behind a desk of reclaimed mahogany, a heavy glass tumbler of bourbon, sweating onto a stack of shipping manifests. He hated this warehouse. It smelled of rust-damp earth and decades of bad decisions. But it was necessary. Separation of church and state, his father used to say. You don't bring the dirt of the docks into the pristine towers of the city. He checked his watch. 2:15 in the morning. Sadie Bennett was late. She wasn't a rival. She wasn't an assassin. She was a 24-year-old art restorer who had the sheer, monumental bad luck of being Arthur Bennett's younger sister. Arthur had been a mid-level accountant for Victor's enterprise. Arthur had also been skimming off the top. When Arthur caught a bullet in a bad deal down in Miami 2 weeks ago, a very specific, very encrypted flash drive went missing. Victor's people had tracked the digital footprint right to Sadie's modest apartment in the garment district. Victor didn't care about the girl. He cared about the drive. Call Leon again, Victor murmured, not looking up from the paperwork. Across the room, a heavy-set man named Paul leaned against the doorframe. Paul grunted, pulling a burner phone from his jacket. It's ringing. Leon said they had a visual on her at the diner on 4th an hour ago. She tried to make a run for the subway. Victor finally raised his head. His features were sharp, carved by stress and a life devoid of genuine sleep. He possessed a cynical sort of handsome face, hard eyes, a jaw that permanently carried tension. I explicitly told Leon to keep it quiet. No scenes, no panic. Grab her, get the drive, bring her to me. Leon knows the drill boss. Victor wasn't convinced. He didn't trust Leon. Leon was a blunt instrument, a hammer looking for a nail. But he was also the only one close enough to intercept the girl before she panicked and handed the drive over to the feds, thinking it would buy her protection. Protection was a myth. In this city, there was only power, and the people crushed beneath it. The heavy metal door at the end of the corridor shrieked on its hinges. Footsteps echoed off the concrete. Heavy boots, muffled scuffling. Victor stood. He buttoned his suit jacket, a reflex of control. He prepared his face, smoothing it into the blank, impenetrable mask that had made the Hale name a whispered terror in the underworld. He would ask her for the drive. He would offer her a sum of money to leave the state and forget she ever had a brother. It was a clean transaction. The office door swung open. Leon walked in. First chest puffed out, breathing heavily. He looked like a man expecting a medal. Behind him, 2 other enforcers, Mick and a kid Victor only knew as Teeth, dragged a small, limp figure between them. Got her, Leon announced, a sickeningly proud grin splitting his face. She put up a hell of a fight, Mr. Hale. Scrappy little thing. Tried to bite Mick. They stopped in the center of the room. Mick and the kid let go. Sadie collapsed onto the floor. She didn't catch herself. She just fell a heavy deadweight slump against the unforgiving concrete. Victor froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The low hum of the generator outside faded into a ringing silence in his ears. He stepped out from behind the desk, his polished shoes silent on the floorboards. He looked down. Sadie was wearing a faded yellow sweater. It was torn at the collar, the wool stained with dark, wet patches. Her brown hair was matted to the side of her face with drying blood. But it was her face that made Victor's heart stop, then kick-start into a violent, erratic rhythm. Her left eye was swollen shut, the skin around it, a horrific landscape of bruised purple and angry red. Her lip was split, still leaking a steady stream of scarlet down her chin. A dark, vicious bruise was already forming on her pale jawline, the exact shape and size of a large man's hand. She was conscious, but barely. Her good eye fluttered, staring blankly at the dust on Victor's shoes. She let out a shallow, rattling breath, curling her knees to her chest in a desperate, instinctual bid to protect her ribs. She looked like a broken bird. Victor felt something snap. It wasn't a metaphorical breaking. It was a physical sensation, a sickening pop at the base of his skull. The cold, calculating monster that ran the city evaporated, replaced by something primal, something terrifyingly unhinged. "What?" Victor said, his voice dropping to a whisper that scraped like sandpaper. "What is this?" Leon chuckled, completely missing the sheer vibrating danger radiating from his boss. Like I said, she was a runner. Had to subdue her. She wouldn't hand over the bag, so we had to rough her up a little to make her understand the gravity of the situation. You know how it is. "A little." Victor repeated the words. He stared at the handprint on Sadie's jaw. "Yeah. Bitch fights like a cornered rat." Mick chimed in, rubbing his own forearm. "She's got the drive in her coat pocket." We checked. Victor slowly lifted his gaze from the broken woman on the floor to the three men standing over her. His eyes were dead. Flat and black. The cynicism that usually shielded him from the ugliness of his world had burned away, leaving only white-hot, blinding rage. He hadn't felt this. Not in 10 years. Not since he watched his own mother bleed out on a kitchen floor. "I told you," Victor said, his voice barely audible over the roaring in his own ears, "to bring her to me. And here she is." Leon smiled. It was the last time Leon would ever smile. Violence is usually loud. It's screaming and chaos and the clatter of overturning furniture. But the violence that erupted in that office was suffocatingly quiet. Victor moved. He didn't telegraph the strike. He simply crossed the 2 feet of space between him and Leon and drove his fist into the center of the larger man's throat. Cartilage crunched. Leon's eyes bugged out of his skull. The proud grin vanished, replaced by a wet, desperate gargle. He brought his hands up to his neck, stumbling backward, his knees instantly buckling. Mick and Teeth froze, their brains failing to process the sudden shift in reality. The boss didn't hit his own men. The boss was a businessman. The boss delegated. Victor wasn't delegating tonight. As Leon hit the ground, clawing at his crushed windpipe, Victor pivoted. He grabbed the heavy glass tumbler of bourbon off his desk. In one fluid motion, he smashed it directly into the side of Mick's head. The glass shattered whiskey, and blood spraying across the cinder block wall. Mick went down like a felled tree, unconscious, before he hit the floor. Teeth took a step back, raising his hands in sheer terror. Boss, wait. Who put their hands on her?" Victor demanded. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a guttural snarl that shook the dust from the rafters. His knuckles were bleeding, cut by the glass, but he didn't feel it. "It was Leon," the kid shrieked, backing into the doorframe. "Leon hit her. She scratched him and he just lost it. I swear to God, Mr. Hale, I didn't touch her." Victor stared at the kid, his chest heaving, his tie crooked. He looked down at his own trembling, bloody hands. He took a long, jagged breath, forcing the animal back into its cage. The damage was done. The point was made. "Get them out of my sight." Victor ordered, not looking at the kid. "If Leon survives, tell him he is excommunicated. If he sets foot in this city again, I will flay him. Drag them out." Now, Teeth didn't hesitate. Whimpering, he grabbed Mick by the collar, dragging him out into the hall, leaving Leon choking and wheezing on the floor. Paul, the guard who had been watching from the doorway in stunned silence, quickly stepped in, hauling the gasping Leon out by his armpits. The door clicked shut. Silence returned, thick and heavy. Victor stood alone in the center of the room. The adrenaline was receding, leaving a cold, hollow ache in his chest. He turned his attention back to the floor. Sadie hadn't moved. She was curled tight, her breath hitching in a wet, pained rhythm. Victor sank to his knees. He ruined a pair of $1,000 suit pants on the filthy concrete, but he didn't care. He hesitated, his bloodied hands hovering awkwardly over her shaking form. He had ordered deaths. He had destroyed businesses. He had never comforted anyone. He didn't know how. "Sadie," he said softly. It felt strange on his tongue. He had only ever thought of her as leverage, as a target. She flinched violently at the sound of his voice, curling tighter, letting out a small, broken whimper that felt like a knife twisting in his gut. "Don't!" she breathed, her voice raspy and slurred. "Please, don't hit me again. I'll give it to you. Just stop." Shame, hot and toxic, flooded Victor's veins. He was the monster in the dark. He was the reason she was here bleeding on a warehouse floor. His men had done this, which meant he had done this. "I'm not going to hit you," Victor said. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clean white linen handkerchief. "I'm going to get you out of here." He reached out, his movements painfully slow, and gently pressed the linen to her bleeding lip. Sadie gasped, her good eye flying open in panic. She tried to scramble backward, but her bruised ribs protested, and she collapsed with a sharp cry of pain. "Easy." Victor hushed his voice, entirely devoid of its usual icy command. "Look at me. Look at me, Sadie." She blinked through tears and blood, her terrified gaze finally locking onto his. She saw the sharp angles of his face, the dark intensity in his eyes. But she also saw the fear, the absolute, unvarnished panic of a man who realized he had pushed the world too far. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I'm the man who's going to fix this," Victor replied. Without waiting for permission, he slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her shoulders. He braced himself and stood, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. She was so light, too light. She let out a small groan of pain, her head lolling against his chest. She smelled like rain, cheap vanilla soap, and copper. Victor walked past his desk, ignoring the scattered manifests and the blood pooling on the floor. He kicked the office door open and strode down the corridor. His men lined the walls, standing at attention, their eyes wide with shock. None of them spoke. None of them breathed. They watched their ruthless, untouchable boss carry a broken, bleeding girl out of the warehouse as if she were made of spun glass. "Paul," Victor barked as he reached the exit. "Yes, boss. Have the car brought around, and call Dr. Adams. Tell him to meet us at the penthouse. If he isn't there in 20 minutes, I'll bury him." "Right away." Victor stepped out into the cool, damp night air. The city lights smeared against the dark sky. Sadie shivered in his arms, her fingers weakly curling into the lapel of his ruined suit. He tightened his grip on her, stepping into the back of the waiting SUV. He had brought her into his hell. Now, God help him, he was going to have to find a way to pull her out of it. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private elevator, blurring the neon sprawl of the city into streaks of bleeding color. Victor stood rigid, holding Sadie. She was unconscious again, her head tucked beneath his chin. She weighed next to nothing. The silence in the glass box was absolute, save for the rhythmic wet drag of her breathing. Every exhalation sounded like tearing paper. He stared straight ahead at his own reflection in the darkened glass. He didn't recognize the man staring back. The man in the glass had blood smeared across his expensive dress shirt, his tie discarded somewhere in the back of the SUV, his eyes hollowed out by a sudden, violent shift in his reality. Victor Hale was a man of systems, cause and effect, transaction and collection. There was no protocol for this. The elevator chimed a soft, pleasant sound that mocked the brutality of the night, and the doors slid open to the penthouse. It was a sprawling space of cold slate-brushed steel and stark white walls, a monument to isolation. Victor bypassed the main living area, carrying her down the wide hallway to the guest suite. He kicked the door shut behind him and laid her gently on the center of the bed. The sheets were pristine, high-thread count Egyptian cotton. Within seconds, a dark, muddy stain of dirt and blood began to bloom beneath her head. Victor didn't care. He stepped back, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. "Mr. Hale?" Victor turned. Dr. Adams stood in the doorway, a black leather medical bag gripped tightly in his hands. He was a balding man in his 50s, usually unflappable, having patched up more bullet holes and knife wounds than a combat medic. But as his eyes flicked from Victor's blood-soaked hands to the battered woman on the bed, his professional veneer cracked. "Fix her," Victor said. His voice was entirely devoid of inflection. It was a terrifying sound. Dr. Adams swallowed hard, nodding. He moved to the bed, clicking on the heavy brass bedside lamp. The harsh light washed over Sadie's face, throwing the grotesque swelling of her eye and the dark, angry handprint on her jaw into sharp relief. The doctor hissed through his teeth. "Who did this?" Adams muttered, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. "Dead men," Victor replied. He didn't leave the room. He retreated to the shadowed corner by the window, sinking into a heavy leather armchair. He watched. He watched as the doctor gently cut away the ruined yellow sweater. He watched as Adams meticulously cleaned the split lip, the jagged scrape along her collarbone, the deep purple bruising mottled across her ribs. Every time she whimpered in her sleep, every time she flinched away from the iodine, a muscle in Victor's jaw ticked. "2 cracked ribs," Dr. Adams said, quietly, wrapping her torso with expert precision. "Mild concussion. The orbital bone isn't fractured miraculously, but the swelling will take days to go down. She's going to be in a lot of pain when she wakes up. Give her something for it." "I will. I'm starting an IV now for fluids and a mild analgesic. She's severely dehydrated." Adams paused, looking over his shoulder at the shadowed corner. "She shouldn't be moved, Victor. Not for at least 48 hours. She stays here." Adams raised an eyebrow but knew better than to ask questions. He finished his work in silence, packing away his tools, leaving a few bottles of pills on the nightstand. "I'll be back tomorrow evening to check the concussion. Keep her awake if she rouses just for a few minutes at a time. Make sure she knows her name." "I know how a concussion works, Doctor." Adams nodded tightly. "Good night, Victor." The door clicked shut. The penthouse fell into a profound, suffocating silence. Victor sat in the dark for a long time. He listened to the hum of the climate control and the steady artificial drip of the IV bag hanging from the makeshift stand. The drive, the encrypted piece of metal that had started all of this, was currently sitting on his kitchen island. Paul had pulled it from Sadie's coat pocket before bringing the coat up. Victor had what he wanted. Arthur Bennett's theft was handled. The ledger was clean. So why was he still sitting in this chair? He stood walking slowly to the edge of the bed. Under the warm glow of the bedside lamp, Sadie looked fragile, but not entirely broken. The fierce, desperate way she had curled in on herself in the warehouse was gone, replaced by the heavy drug-induced slackness of sleep. Victor reached out his knuckles, brushing against a lock of brown hair that had fallen across her unbruised cheek. His hand was trembling. He pulled it back sharply, disgusted with his own lack of control. He was a predator. Predators didn't nurse their prey back to health. They finished the job, but as he looked down at the pale, battered face of the art restorer, Victor realized the fundamental truth that had fractured his world in the warehouse. She wasn't prey. She was collateral damage. And for the first time in his meticulously orchestrated life, Victor Hale felt the crushing, unbearable weight of guilt. He turned away from the bed, walking into the adjoining bathroom to finally wash the drying blood from his hands. It took a long time and a lot of soap to get the water to run clear. Consciousness didn't return to Sadie all at once. It bled in slowly, dragging her up through layers of thick, suffocating fog. The first thing she registered was the smell. It wasn't the damp rot of her apartment building, nor the chemical tang of her restoration studio. It was clean, expensive, a sharp blend of cedar and ozone. The second thing she registered was the pain. It hit her like a physical blow the moment she tried to take a deep breath. A sharp, white-hot agony flared in her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. She gasped, her eyes flying open instantly, regretting the movement as a sickening throb pulsed behind her left eye. She blinked against the glare of morning sunlight streaming through a gap in heavy charcoal drapes. The ceiling was impossibly high. The sheets covering her were heavy, smooth as water. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. The warehouse. The memory hit her with the force of a train. The men waiting outside her apartment. The struggle in the alley. The suffocating grip on her arms. The man with the dead eyes who hit her until the world turned sideways. And then, the boss. The man in the suit who shattered a glass against a skull and carried her out into the rain. Sadie forced herself to sit up. The room tilted dangerously. She gripped the edge of the mattress, waiting for the nausea to pass. She looked down. She was wearing an oversized grey t-shirt that smelled faintly of expensive cologne. Her ribs were tightly bound. A thin tube ran from her hand to an empty IV bag on a metal stand. She ripped the tape off her hand and pulled the needle out, wincing at the sharp sting. A drop of blood welled up bright and red against her pale skin. She wiped it away with her thumb. She needed to leave. She needed her coat. She needed the drive. Arthur had told her to hide it. If anything happens to me, Sadie, give it to the feds. Don't let them have it. It's your only leverage. Arthur was an idiot. A sweet, naive idiot who thought he could outsmart the devil. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet touched a plush, cold rug. She stood up, her knees buckling instantly. She caught herself on the nightstand, sending a small plastic pill bottle clattering to the floor. The noise sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. She held her breath, waiting. Nothing happened. Gritting her teeth against the pain radiating from her ribs, Sadie limped toward the heavy oak door. She didn't bother looking for a weapon. In this world, a lamp or a pair of scissors wasn't going to save her. She just needed a phone. She pulled the door open. The penthouse living room was cavernous, a study in modern brutalism. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the city, bathed in harsh morning light. And sitting at a massive island of black marble, nursing a cup of black coffee, was the man from the warehouse. Victor Hale. He had changed out of the ruined suit. He wore a dark crewneck sweater and slacks, looking less like a mob boss and more like a weary tech CEO. He didn't look up when the door opened, but his voice carried easily across the quiet room. "You shouldn't be walking. Dr. Adams said 48 hours. Sadie froze her hand, gripping the doorframe. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. She forced herself to stand straight, ignoring the scream of her muscles. "Where is my coat?" she asked. Her voice was weak, raspy, grating against her dry throat. Victor finally turned his head. In the daylight, his features were even sharper, his dark eyes deeply shadowed with exhaustion. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over the oversized shirt, the bandages, the horrific mosaic of bruises on her face. A subtle flinch, almost imperceptible, passed over his expression. "Your coat was ruined," Victor said evenly. "I had it thrown away. The drive that was in the pocket is currently in a safe behind me." Sadie's stomach dropped. The floor felt entirely too far away. The leverage was gone. She was nothing now. Just a loose end. "So," she breathed, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "What happens now? You got what you wanted. Are you going to have someone drag me to a different warehouse?" Victor set his coffee mug down. The clink of ceramic against marble was sharp. "No." "Then let me go." "I can't do that." "Why not? I don't know anything. I don't know what's on the drive. I don't know your operations. Arthur just—" Sadie stopped. The reality of the situation, the terrifying finality of it, suddenly crashed over her. Arthur had given her the drive 2 weeks ago. He hadn't called since. "Where is my brother?" Victor didn't look away. He didn't offer a platitude or a lie. He sat perfectly still, absorbing the weight of her question. "Arthur is dead," Victor said, his voice flat, devoid of cruelty, but completely uncompromising. "He stole from me. He tried to sell my ledger to a rival outfit in Miami. They killed him for it, hoping to find the drive on his body. They didn't. You had it." Sadie stared at him. The words didn't make sense. Arthur was an accountant. He played fantasy football and complained about his cholesterol. He didn't die in Miami. He didn't deal with monsters. A sharp, breathless sound escaped her throat. It wasn't a sob. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. Her knees finally gave out. She didn't fall to the floor. She just slowly slid down the doorframe until she was sitting on the hardwood, her knees pulled to her chest, staring blankly at the floor. Victor watched her. He had delivered death notices before. Usually there was screaming, crying, threats. Sadie just sat there silent, the last remnants of her world shattering around her. He stood up, walking across the vast room, until he stood a few feet in front of her. He didn't try to touch her. He knew better. "The men who hurt you last night," Victor said quietly, "will never breathe free air again. That is not how I operate. I am apologizing, Sadie Bennett, for my men, not for your brother." Sadie slowly lifted her head. Her good eye met his, and what Victor saw there made him stop breathing. There was no fear left. The terror had burned out, replaced by a cold, hollow devastation. "I don't care about your apologies," she whispered, her voice scraping the air. "I just want to go home." "You don't have a home anymore," Victor said gently. "The people who killed your brother are looking for that drive. They know who you are. If you walk out of that door, you will be dead before sundown." He crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. "You're staying here. With me. Grief is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow, methodical suffocation." Sadie didn't scream. She didn't thrash or throw things at the reinforced glass. She simply pulled her knees tighter against her chest, burying her face in the fabric of Victor's oversized shirt. The silence that followed was heavier than the heavy oak door she leaned against. It pressed down on her, squeezing the remaining air from her bruised lungs. Arthur was dead. Her foolish, ambitious, eternally optimistic brother, who had promised her he was just doing bookkeeping for a legitimate shipping firm. He had lied. He had stolen. And he had paid for it with his life, leaving her to clean up the blood. Victor remained crouched in front of her. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't reach out to pat her shoulder. He understood the anatomy of a shattered reality better than anyone. Instead, he stood up his joints, popping softly in the quiet room. "I am going to have Paul bring up some food," Victor said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than her indefinite captivity. "You haven't eaten in at least 2 days. Your body needs fuel to repair the tissue damage." Sadie didn't respond. She just kept her head down, her breathing shallow and ragged. Victor walked over to the kitchen island, picking up a sleek black phone. He pressed a single button, murmured an order for scrambled eggs and dry toast, and hung up. He leaned against the marble counter, crossing his arms, and watched her. He had a million things to do. The Miami outfit, led by a ruthless pragmatist named Carver, would realize their hitmen had failed to secure the drive. They would be sending more men. Victor needed to mobilize his lieutenants, lock down the ports, and prepare for a war he hadn't intended to start. Yet he couldn't leave the penthouse. 20 minutes later, the private elevator chimed. Paul stepped out, carrying a silver tray. He kept his eyes carefully averted from the small, broken figure, slumped against the doorframe. He set the tray on the island, nodded tightly to Victor, and vanished back into the elevator. Victor picked up a plate and a glass of water. He walked back over to Sadie and set them on the floor beside her. "Eat." "I'm not hungry," she whispered to her knees. "Hunger is irrelevant. It's mechanics. You eat or you wither. I won't watch you wither." Sadie finally raised her head. The swelling around her left eye had settled into a deep, ugly violet, making her look like a survivor of a car wreck. Her good eye, however, was sharp. The devastation was still there, but a flicker of absolute, unadulterated hatred had sparked beneath it. "You killed him," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Carver's men killed him in Miami," Victor corrected smoothly. "I had no hand in his death. He worked for you. He died because of your world. If I hadn't employed him, he would have found another mobster to steal from." Victor cut in. His voice wasn't angry, just impossibly cold. "Your brother was a thief, Sadie, a sloppy one. He sought out the underworld because he wanted the money, but he didn't respect the rules. The world doesn't tolerate tourists. It eats them. The blunt cruelty of the truth hit her like a second beating. She wanted to argue. She wanted to defend Arthur's memory. But the flash drive in Victor's safe was undeniable proof. Arthur had gambled with their lives. She looked down at the plate of eggs. Her stomach gave a violent, painful, hollow churn. The instinct to survive, primal and deeply ingrained, flared up against her despair. Slowly, with trembling hands, she picked up the fork. Victor watched her take the first bite. She chewed mechanically, swallowing as if the eggs were made of ash. But she ate. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice raspy, scraping her fork against the porcelain. "You have the drive. You have what you want. I'm a liability. Why not just hand me over to this Carver person and be done with it?" Victor looked away from her, his gaze drifting to the sprawling skyline beyond the glass. Rain was still spitting against the windows, a grey, miserable morning. Because, Victor said quietly, my men put their hands on you. They crossed a line in my name. That makes you my responsibility. I don't want to be your responsibility. I want to go back to my studio. Your studio was tossed by Carver's men 3 hours ago, Victor said. He turned back to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. They tore the walls down to the studs. They smashed your equipment. If you had been there, you would be in pieces right now. You are staying here, Sadie, not as a prisoner, as a ghost. As far as the city is concerned, you vanished the night Arthur died. Sadie set the fork down. The food turned to lead in her stomach. The absolute finality in his voice terrified her more than the violence in the warehouse. He wasn't threatening her. He was stating a fact. Her life, the quiet days, restoring oil paintings, the small apartment smelling of turpentine. The annoying phone calls from Arthur was gone. Erased. How long? She asked, her voice cracking. Until I cut the head off the snake in Miami, Victor replied. Until it's safe. He walked away, leaving her sitting on the floor with a half-eaten plate of eggs. He retreated to his office down the hall, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Sadie was alone in the vast, sterile living room. She looked at the bandages wrapped around her hand, at the bruises covering her skin. She had survived the night. But as she stared out at the unforgiving city, she realized the true nightmare was only just beginning. She was locked in a tower with the devil, and the worst part was, he was the only one keeping her alive. 4 days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light across the slate floors and the agonizingly slow fade of purple to yellow on Sadie's skin. The penthouse was a gilded cage, silent and perfectly climate-controlled. Dr. Adams came every evening, checked her vitals, shined a pen light into her eyes, and left without saying more than a dozen words. Paul stood guard outside the elevator bank. Groceries appeared in the refrigerator. Fresh high-end clothing, soft cashmere sweaters, silk loungewear things Sadie could never afford were placed silently in her closet by unseen hands. She rarely saw Victor. He was a ghost in his own home. He left before she woke, returning long after she had retreated to the guest suite. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night, driven by the throbbing ache in her ribs, and see a sliver of light spilling from his home office. She would hear the low, gravelly hum of his voice on the phone, speaking in clipped, dangerous tones. He was managing a war. Sadie spent her days pacing. Once the sharpest pain in her chest subsided into a dull, manageable ache, the claustrophobia set in. She was a woman used to working with her hands, used to meticulously scraping away decades of grime to reveal the beauty underneath. Here there was nothing to fix. The penthouse was aggressively flawless. On the afternoon of the 5th day, she found the library. It was tucked away behind the formal dining room, a stark contrast to the modern brutalism of the rest of the apartment. Dark walnut shelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes. The air smelled of old paper and leather. It felt warm. It felt human. But what drew Sadie's eye wasn't the books. It was the painting hanging above the unlit fireplace. It was a late 19th century landscape, a dark, stormy seascape. It was a beautiful piece, raw and violent, capturing a ship being battered against jagged rocks. But as Sadie stepped closer, her professional eye caught the tragic flaw. A thick, clumsy layer of varnish had been applied decades ago, yellowing the turbulent grey skies into a sickly, jaundiced green. Someone had tried to clean a corner and botched it, leaving a harsh chemical burn on the canvas that ruined the depth of the waves. It's ruined. Sadie jumped, spinning around. Her ribs screamed in protest, but she ignored them. Victor was standing in the doorway, He looked exhausted. His tie was loose, the top button of his shirt undone, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of consecutive sleepless nights. He held a glass of amber liquid in his right hand. "I bought it at an auction 5 years ago," Victor said, stepping fully into the room. "The broker told me it was a lost masterpiece. I just thought it looked exactly how I felt." Sadie swallowed hard, her heart doing a familiar, frantic flutter. Even tired, he radiated an oppressive gravitational authority. They lied to you, or they were incompetent. The original artist used a specific glare binder. Whoever tried to clean it used an alcohol solvent. They melted the top layer of paint. It's a tragedy, honestly. Victor walked over, standing beside her. He was close enough that she could smell the bourbon and the distinct scent of cedar and rain. She stiffened instinctively, bracing herself, but he didn't look at her. He just stared at the painting. "Can it be fixed?" he asked. Sadie looked back at the canvas. "It would take months. Meticulous, agonizing work under a microscope, using a scalpel to remove the burnt varnish millimeter by millimeter without touching the original pigment. And even then, the scar will always be there. You can't unburn a canvas. You can only stabilize it so the rot doesn't spread. A pragmatic assessment." Victor took a slow sip of his drink. "You are very good at what you do, Sadie." "I was," she corrected bitterly, "until your world burned my studio down." The silence in the library thickened. Victor turned his head, finally looking down at her. The swelling on her face had reduced drastically, revealing the sharp, delicate bone structure beneath. The cut on her lip was a thin pink line. She was healing, but the guarded defensive posture she held, arms crossed over her chest, eyes hard and untrusting, showed him that the internal wounds were still bleeding freely. "I received word from Miami an hour ago," Victor said, changing the subject with the jarring abruptness of a man who didn't deal in emotions. Sadie's breath hitched. Carver is escalating. He hit one of my warehouses in Brooklyn this morning, burned it to the ground. He's trying to draw me out, trying to force a negotiation over the drive. Give it to him." Sadie pleaded, the frustration boiling over. "Just give it to him and let this end. Why do you care about some ledger? You have millions of dollars. Is a piece of metal worth a war? It is not about the money, Sadie." Victor snapped, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his icy exterior. "It is about the precedent. In my world, if you bleed the shark circle, if I hand Carver that drive, I am telling every outfit from here to Chicago that Victor Hale can be extorted. I am telling them they can kill my accountants, torture innocent women in my warehouses, and get a reward for it." He stepped closer, dominating her field of vision. Sadie held her ground, refusing to back away, though her pulse hammered wildly in her throat. "If I show weakness," Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous vibrating frequency, "I am dead. And if I am dead, the protection order I have placed on you vanishes. Carver's men will find you, and they will not be as gentle as Leon was." The name struck her like a physical blow. She flinched, the memory of the warehouse roaring back with sickening clarity. Victor saw the flinch. He saw the color drain from her face. He stopped, cursing himself silently. He set his glass down on a nearby side table with a sharp crack. "I have to leave the city," he announced, running a hand through his dark hair. "I have to meet with the families in New Jersey to solidify the lines. I will be gone for 2 days. Panic, irrational and swift, seized her. She hated him. He was a monster. But he was her monster. He was the only thing standing between her and the men who had murdered her brother. "You're leaving me here?" she asked, hating the slight tremor in her voice. "Paul will remain outside the door. 2 more men will be stationed in the lobby and another in the service elevator. The glass is bulletproof. The doors are reinforced steel. No one gets in. Victor looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face, looking for something he couldn't quite name. You are safe here, Sadie. I promise you that. Your promises are written in blood, Mr. Hale, she whispered. Victor's jaw tightened. Yes, they are. And I've spilled enough of it recently to ensure yours isn't next. He turned on his heel and walked out of the library, leaving her alone with the ruined painting and a terrifying hollow dread. Morning broke, with a dull, sickly yellow light slipping through a gap in the heavy charcoal drapes. Sadie hadn't slept. She spent the hours pacing the length of the guest suite, her bare feet silent against the cold hardwood, her mind a spinning carousel of worst-case scenarios. Victor was gone. The penthouse felt impossibly hollow, without his suffocating gravity holding the space together. But it didn't feel safe. It felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. She needed to do something with her hands. Idle time was a poison that let the grief for Arthur creep up her throat and choke her. Around noon, she ventured into the sprawling kitchen. She bypassed the high-end espresso machine and the meticulously stocked refrigerator, dropping to her knees to dig through the cabinets under the sink. Among the organic cleaners, she found a small bottle of high-grade mineral spirits and a roll of heavy-duty paper towels. She grabbed a handful of cotton swabs from the guest bathroom and carried her makeshift kit into the library. The ruined seascape hung over the fireplace, its jaundiced, chemical-burned skies mocking her. Sadie pulled a heavy leather chair over to the mantel and climbed up, wincing as her fractured ribs protested the stretch. She didn't have her magnifiers. She didn't have her scalpels. She just had a Q-tip, a harsh solvent, and a desperate need to fix something broken. She dipped the swab into the mineral spirits, tapping off the excess, and selected a tiny, inconspicuous corner of the dark water at the bottom of the canvas. She applied the swab, rolling it gently over the hardened varnish. Focus narrowed her world. The fear receded, replaced by the familiar meditative rhythm of pressure and release. She watched the cotton turn a faint, muddy yellow. The solvent was too aggressive. It would strip the original oil if left for more than a few seconds. She quickly neutralized it with a dry towel. Beneath the smear, a millimeter of deep, vibrant indigo peeked through the grime. A genuine, uncorrupted color. A sharp, mechanical clack echoed through the penthouse. Sadie froze, the cotton swab hovering an inch from the canvas. The low, steady hum of the central air conditioning died instantly. The soft, recessed lighting above the bookshelves blinked out. The penthouse was plunged into heavy, unnatural silence. She scrambled off the chair, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in her chest, and backed into the darkest corner of the library. Victor had promised she was safe. He had men in the lobby. He had Paul outside the door. A heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards, coming from the direction of the private elevator. Then a voice. "Clear the hall. Breach the lock." It wasn't Paul. The voice was rough, unhurried, echoing slightly in the vastness of the living room. Carver's men. They hadn't hit the lobby. They had bypassed the security grid, completely likely scaling the adjacent scaffolding of the building next door and crossing over to the terrace. Sadie's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked around for a weapon. A brass letter opener on the desk. A heavy glass ashtray. Useless against men who carried automatic weapons as casually as briefcases. Footsteps approached the library. Heavy boots on hardwood. She pressed herself flat against the walnut paneling, behind the open door, holding her breath until her lungs burned. Her fingers clamped around the small bottle of mineral spirits. A shadow fell across the threshold. A man stepped into the library. He wore dark tactical gear, a suppressed pistol gripped firmly in his right hand. He swept the room, the barrel of the gun tracing the shadows. He didn't look behind the door. He moved toward the fireplace, his boots crushing the cotton swabs she had dropped on the rug. "Library's empty," the man called out over his shoulder. "Check the bedrooms. Find the girl. Carver wants her breathing, but he didn't say she had to be walking." The man turned to leave. As he pivoted, his elbow bumped the heavy oak door, pushing it back on its hinges. The door swung backward, pinning Sadie against the bookcase. The man stopped. He looked at the gap between the door hinges. Sadie didn't think. Instinct, raw and violent, hijacked her nervous system. As the man shoved the door fully open and raised his pistol, she threw the open bottle of mineral spirits directly into his face. The man shrieked a wet, guttural sound, dropping his weapon to claw at his burning eyes. Sadie dove to the floor, scrambling past his thrashing legs. She grabbed the heavy brass letter opener off the desk and scrambled out into the hallway. "Hey!" another voice shouted from the kitchen. She didn't look back. She ran toward the only place in the penthouse that offered any illusion of safety, Victor's office. She threw her weight against the heavy mahogany door, slipping inside, and slammed it shut, twisting the deadbolt. It was a pathetic barrier. They would shoot the lock out in seconds. She backed away from the door, her chest heaving, the letter opener clutched in her slick, shaking hands. She looked around the dimly lit office. Behind Victor's desk, a section of the wood paneling sat slightly ajar. A safe room. Paul must have opened it before they took him down. Heavy fists began pounding on the office door. Wood splintered around the frame. Sadie lunged behind the desk, squeezed through the narrow gap in the paneling, and pulled the heavy steel door shut behind her. The locking mechanism engaged with a heavy, definitive thunk. Complete, suffocating darkness swallowed her whole. Time lost all meaning inside the steel box. Sadie sat on the cold floor, her knees pulled to her chest, the brass letter opener digging into her palm. The panic room was pitch black and smelled faintly of copper and stale air. For the first hour, she heard the muffled, terrifying sounds of destruction leaking through the thick metal gunfire, shattering glass, heavy objects being overturned. Carver's men were tearing the penthouse apart looking for her. Then the noise stopped. She waited in the dark. She listened to the phantom ringing in her ears, her own heartbeat loud and erratic. Had they left? Were they waiting on the other side of the door? Hours dragged by. Thirst scraped at her throat, but she didn't dare move. She wouldn't open that door. They would have to cut it down. A loud metallic clank vibrated through the floor. Sadie scrambled backward until her spine hit the back wall. The heavy tumblers of the safe room lock began to turn. Click, click, click. The heavy steel door groaned open. Harsh, bright light flooded the small space, blinding her. She squeezed her eyes shut, raising the letter opener in a trembling hand, preparing to strike whoever reached in. "Put it down, Sadie." The voice was rough, exhausted, and barely recognizable, but it wasn't one of Carver's men. She forced her eyes open. Victor stood in the doorway. He looked entirely destroyed. His dark suit jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was torn at the shoulder, soaked in a massive, blooming stain of dark crimson. His face was pale, smeared with grease and soot, and he was leaning heavily against the doorframe just to stay upright. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a casualty. Sadie lowered the letter opener. The adrenaline drained out of her in a rush, leaving her limbs weak and shaking. She crawled forward, blinking against the light of the ruined office. The penthouse had been decimated. Bullet holes chewed through the drywall. The heavy mahogany desk was overturned, papers scattered like snow. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "They're dead," Victor corrected flatly. He pushed himself off the doorframe, swaying dangerously. "Paul got 2 of them. I got the rest. You came back. I got the call that the perimeter was breached." He took a slow, agonizing step toward the leather sofa against the far wall and collapsed onto it. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his clenched teeth. "Lock the office door, then grab the black duffel bag from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet." Sadie didn't argue. The terrifying reality was that Victor Hale, bleeding out on a sofa, was currently the only thing keeping her alive. She locked the splintered door, retrieved the heavy canvas bag, and dragged it over to him. It was a trauma kit. Tourniquets, gauze, sutures, heavy painkillers. "Where is Dr. Adams?" she asked, unzipping the bag. "Adams is compromised. Carver paid him off to give them the security codes to the service elevator." Victor opened his eyes. They were completely black, devoid of light. "I dealt with him before I came up here." A cold shiver raced down Sadie's spine. She understood exactly what "dealt with" meant. "I need you to pull the shirt off." Victor said, his breathing shallow. "I caught a ricochet. It went through the meat of the shoulder, but it didn't hit the artery. It needs to be packed and stitched." Sadie stared at him, horrified. "I'm not a doctor. I fix paintings." "Flesh is just canvas, Sadie. Thread the needle. Pour the iodine. If you don't stop the bleeding, I pass out. If I pass out, we have no extraction plan, and Carver's secondary team will find us here by morning." He wasn't manipulating her. He was stating the stark, brutal math of their situation. Sadie swallowed her panic. She nodded once. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears from the bag and cut away the ruined, blood-soaked fabric of his shirt, peeling it back. The wound was ugly. A jagged, torn hole just below his collarbone, leaking a steady stream of dark blood. She soaked a pad of gauze in iodine. "This is going to burn. Do it." She pressed the iodine-soaked gauze directly into the wound. Victor's entire body went rigid. His jaw locked the muscles in his neck, standing out like steel cables, but he didn't make a sound. He just stared at the ceiling, his breathing coming in harsh, measured rasps. Sadie's hands were shaking, but as she picked up the surgical needle and the thick black thread, the restorer in her took over. She had spent thousands of hours meticulously stitching together torn canvases, repairing damage with absolute precision. She locked her focus onto the torn edges of his skin. "The meeting in Jersey," she said quietly, trying to distract him as she pushed the needle through the tough layers of his skin. "Did it go wrong?" Carver set an ambush. Victor grunted, his eyes squeezing shut as she pulled the thread tight. "He didn't want a negotiation. He wanted me out of the city so his men could come here for you. He knows you're the key to the drive. I don't even know the password to the drive. He doesn't care. He'll torture it out of you or kill you trying." Victor let out a long, slow breath as she tied off the first stitch. He opened his eyes, looking down at her. She was covered in dust from the safe room, her face still bruised, leaning over him with bloody hands. She wasn't crying. She wasn't breaking. "You threw solvent in a mercenary's face." Victor murmured, the faintest trace of dark amusement in his exhausted voice. "He was going to shoot me." Sadie started the second stitch, her jaw set. "You told me I was safe. You lied. I miscalculated. I won't make that mistake again." "You won't get the chance," she said, cutting the thread and packing the wound with clean gauze. "We're leaving." Victor watched her tape the heavy bandage down, feeling the tight, stinging pull of the sutures. He had brought this woman into his world by force. He had broken her life apart. Yet here she was, her hands stained with his blood, stitching him back together. The ledger between them was no longer clean. It was a messy, tangled knot of debt and survival. Yes, Victor agreed softly, his gaze locked on her face. We are. Blood loss made Victor heavy. He leaned against the mahogany desk as he forced himself off the leather sofa. The sutures held a sharp, biting pinch against his collarbone, but the room spun in a slow, nauseating arc. Sadie didn't step back. She slid her shoulder under his good arm, taking a fraction of his weight. It was a terrible idea. She was bruised, nursing cracked ribs, and he was a man who easily outweighed her by 80 pounds. Yet she stood firm, her grip on his waist surprisingly unyielding. The safe, Sadie demanded, her voice tight with the effort of holding him up. Get it. Victor blinked through the grey fuzz invading his vision. He nodded, detached himself from her support, and stumbled toward the hidden panel behind his desk. He punched in a 6-digit code. The biometric scanner was useless with his blood-slicked fingers. The heavy steel door popped open. He bypassed stacks of bearer bonds and emergency passports, grabbing only 2 things, a matte black Glock 19 and a small silver flash drive. He tossed the drive to Sadie. She caught it awkwardly against her chest. Hold on to it, Victor said, his voice a dry rasp. It's your insurance policy now. Sadie stared at the cold metal in her palm, the thing that had killed Arthur, the thing that had destroyed her quiet life. She slipped it into the front pocket of her jeans, the weight of it entirely disproportionate to its physical size. They moved. The penthouse was a graveyard of broken glass and shredded drywall. They stepped over the body of a man in tactical gear near the kitchen. Sadie kept her eyes locked on the back of Victor's neck, refusing to look at the blood pooling on the pristine white tiles. The silence in the ruined apartment was deafening, a sharp contrast to the violent cacophony that had consumed it only an hour earlier. Victor bypassed the main elevator bank and the compromised service lift. He pushed open a discreet, unmarked door in the utility hallway, revealing a narrow concrete stairwell. Maintenance shaft. Victor explained, his breathing labored as they began the descent. Goes all the way down to the subway tunnels. Nobody knows about it except the building's architect, and he's dead. Sadie didn't ask how the architect died. She didn't want to know. They descended 50 floors in silence. The air grew progressively cooler, thick with the smell of ozone, damp concrete, and old rust. Victor's pace slowed with every flight. By the 30th floor, he was leaving a bloody handprint on the cinder block wall with every step. By the 20th floor, his knee buckled, sending him crashing heavily against the metal railing. "Stop!" Sadie ordered. She grabbed his arm, pulling him down onto the cold step. He didn't fight her. He slumped against the wall, his head tipping back, his eyes sliding shut. His skin was the color of dirty chalk. "Victor!" Sadie tapped his cheek, her voice rising in pitch. "Hey, look at me. Do not pass out here." His eyes fluttered open. The dark, bottomless black of his irises was clouded, unfocused. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a terrifying second, the ruthless mob boss was entirely gone. In his place was just a man bleeding out in the dark, stripped of his power, his money, and his untouchable aura. "You should have left me up there," he murmured, taken the drive, walked away. "You owe me nothing." "I wouldn't make it 2 blocks, Sadie snapped, though her hands were shaking as she checked the dressing on his shoulder. It was soaked through, but the bleeding had slowed. "And I don't leave people to die. Unlike your people." Victor let out a weak, humorless laugh that quickly turned into a wet cough. "My people. You're right. We take. We destroy. That's the nature of the beast." He rolled his head to look at her. his gaze dropping to the jagged purple bruise still marring her jawline. "I never intended to drag you into the dark, Sadie. I just wanted my property back." "You don't get to control the fallout," she said softly. "You threw a stone into a lake. You can't tell the ripples where to stop." It was the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. Victor Hale had built an empire on the illusion of absolute control. He compartmentalized the violence. He kept his hands clean. But looking at the ruined art restorer sitting beside him on a dirty stairwell, he realized the ledger could never be balanced. He owed her a debt that money couldn't pay. "When we get out of here," Victor rasped his voice, dropping to a harsh whisper, "I will burn Carver to the ground. I will dismantle his operation, piece by piece. And when it's done, I will give you enough money to disappear to anywhere in the world. You will never have to see my face again." Sadie looked down at her hands. They were stained with his blood. Her yellow sweater was gone. Her studio was ashes. Her brother was in a morgue. The girl who painstakingly cleaned varnish off 19th century landscapes didn't exist anymore. She had been burned away by the harsh solvent of Victor's reality. "I don't want to disappear," Sadie said. Her voice was quiet, but it possessed a new, unbreakable tensile strength. She met his gaze, her eyes cold and clear. "Arthur died because he thought he could play your game and walk away. I'm not walking away, Victor. If I hold the drive, I hold the leverage. You're going to teach me how to survive in this world." Victor stared at her. The shock in his system wasn't entirely from blood loss. He saw the shift, the hardening. He had broken a bird, but he had accidentally forged a hawk. He reached out his bloody fingers, wrapping weakly but firmly around her wrist. It was a pact, a terrifying, irrevocable crossing of the line. "Okay," Victor breathed. "Let's go to war." They hauled themselves upright, leaning heavily into each other, and continued their descent into the suffocating dark. The descent into darkness marks only the beginning of Sadie and Victor's brutal alliance. She was meant to be leverage a disposable pawn in a violent chess game. Instead, she became the queen. Their survival now depends on an unbreakable, dangerous bond forged in blood and betrayal. What happens when the art restorer learns to wield power instead of a scalpel? Thank you for watching this dark journey unfold. If you enjoyed this gritty mafia romance, please hit the like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the video channel for more intense, immersive audio dramas.